ELI5 The amount of one person's ancestors in genealogy is called pedigree collapse. The ELI5 is that we are all related, and if you go back far enough you will find that you very likely have a lot of overlap in your family tree through closer cousins marrying. In my own tree, I found that in one early colonial American branch I have 5 instances of second cousins marrying over a period of maybe 100 years. As a result, I have a lot fewer direct ancestors than I would have otherwise. Now multiple that out over dozens of generations and you wind up with far more realistic and manageable numbers. You're assuming that everyone alive right now has different ancestors. This is wrong because you and your sibling have the same parents. Your parents and their siblings have the same parents, which means you have the same grandparents as your cousins. Follow it back enough and every ancestral line joins up eventually. If everyone in history was an only child then your calculations would be correct, except for the fact that if that was the case then the population would decrease over time. Not everyone in the tree is unique. Sometimes, for instance, you may have a great-grandparent that was a distant cousin of another great-grandparent. When you look at their ancestors, they'll eventually have one in common. The common ancestor, and all of their ancestors, shouldn't be counted twice. The further back you go, the more common this is, especially when you get back to the point of people living in small communities, tribes, or clans. You're assuming that all 137 billion of those ancestors are different people. If your parents happen to be brother and sister, then you'd only have 2 grandparents instead of 4, because your parents shared both parents. That's an extreme example, but if you research your family tree far enough you would eventually start seeing ancestors who appear on both sides of a particular branch, 4th cousins getting married, that sort of thing. The 5500 rule says that a minimum of 50 individuals are required to repopulate the world after a near extinction, and 500 are needed to combat genetic drift. This means that no matter how far back you go in your family tree, a generation could have as few as 50 individuals in it, even if there wasn't an extinction event. And that's assuming there was no inbreeding at any point in it, which is highly unlikely. Maybe if you try thinking of it the other way around it would be more intuitive, like the biblical version of history where everyone is a descendant of Adam and Eve. In that extreme scenario every family tree would eventually merge back to a single set of parents rather than the billions and billions your assumption leads to. In reality this merging has happened at points all the way up everyone's family tree. A paper in Molecular Biology which comes at the problem from a different direction, matrilineal DNA studies suggest that for about 100,000 years there was a long bottleneck during which human populations dropped at times to as few as 2,000 individuals. That's 2,000 people who are the ancestors of everyone alive today. Hello, cousins. Nearly everyone of European ancestry is a descendant of Charlemagne. If all 4 of my grandparents are descendants of Charlemagne, that means Charlemagne fills at least 4 different ancestor slots on my family tree. But it isn't just Charlemagne, it's many of my ancestors, meaning that if you go back far enough most of the names will be duplicated elsewhere in your tree. Incest is wincest. Your great-great-great-granddad from mother's side also happens to be your great-great-great-granddad from your father's side. Further back you go in your family tree more overlap you are going to find. Everybody in one village has the same set of ancestors from few hundred years ago and it's much less than 2 ancestors per n generations. Consider King Joffrey from Game of Thrones. If you go back 2 generations, you would expect 4 grandparents, but he only actually has 2. His grandparents on his mother's side and father's side are the same 2 people because he's an incest baby. Everyone's family tree is ultimately like that, except usually much less icky. When you say ancestors, do you mean purely human ones? You must bear in mind, while what we consider as human ancestors stops at a point, your ancestry does not. Go back far enough, and you'll likely find you're related to a tree shrew-type creature. I would wonder if your original figure for ancestors includes this. Google pedigree collapse, that's what it's called. Basically it's why we are all technically related and we can go back far enough and have found mitochondrial Eve who is a relative to every single person alive today and known as the mother of all modern humans. There used to be a lot more inbreeding also. You're right. Of course it would exceed the number of people who were around at the time. You have to remember how often people will either commit incest directly or marry into families they are distantly related to, which is likely if the family remains in a small area for hundreds of years. Part of the error here is that you are assuming that none of the previous ancestors are related to each other at all, which obviously isn't true as we are all related to each other to different degrees, which would drastically reduce the number of ancestors. If every set of parents only had 1 kid we wouldn't exist. If you have siblings, you all have the same parents and grandparents. So a group of 5 brothers and sisters would still have 2 parents and 4 grandparents, not 32 parents and 1024 grandparents. It's more like by the time the nth generation rolls around, pretty much anyone you choose will have a common ancestors. Not that everyone is banging their sister. More like everyone is a cousin of varying degree. We're all a bunch of inbred mutants. You aren't allowing for the fact that a few generations back there was a lot more inbreeding, so cousins getting married was not uncommon. Also, you tend to marry within the same village town where everyone was probably closely related. You're assuming each person has a set of 2 unique parents, which very much isn't the case, and the more back in time you go, the more children each unique set of parents had. What boggles my mind is the sheer amount of time and evolution and the amount of reproduction that has taken place for me to be in this place at this time. Because your model assumes the human population doubles every 20 years, and that humans live forever, which is obviously not what happens in our universe. There is a lot of crossover in the trees. People used to live in much smaller communities. But even today there will be crossover.